everyone, remembers everything. Last week, one of our cooks made an offhand comment about adding too much salt to the soup. This morning, when she was preparing the same dish, he appeared in the kitchen and suggested she adjust the sodium content downward by approximately 20% compared to the previous iteration. Those were his exact words. Sarutobi couldn't help but chuckle. He does sound precocious. Precocious doesn't begin to cover it, Lord Hokage. He's 3 years old and he reads at a level most 8-year-olds haven't reached yet. We don't know how he learned, none of the staff taught him. He just figured it out. Sarutobi moved closer to the boy, who had now completed a surprisingly complex structure with the blocks. As the Hokage approached, Naruto looked up, his blue eyes focusing with that same eerie intensity he'd shown even as a newborn. "Hello, Naruto," Sarutobi said warmly. "Good afternoon, Lord Hokage," the boy replied, his voice childishly high but his diction perfect. "You're 16 minutes later than your scheduled visit time." Sarutobi blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was scheduled to visit today? The caretakers changed the cleaning schedule when you visit. They dusted the display cabinet this morning instead of Friday. Also, Yumi-san put on the blue kimono she only wears for important guests." He tilted his head slightly. "You're the most important person who ever comes here." The Hokage knelt down, bringing himself closer to the boy's level. "That's very observant of you, Naruto." The boy nodded matter-of-factly, as if this level of perception was perfectly normal. "What happened to delay you? It seemed urgent from the way you entered. Slightly elevated breathing, tension in your left shoulder that indicates you walked quickly to arrive here." For a moment, Sarutobi was speechless. Then he laughed softly. "Administrative matters. Nothing that should concern a young boy. The village's functioning should concern all its residents," Naruto replied calmly, returning his attention to his block structure. With precise movements, he added a final piece to the top, creating what Sarutobi now recognized as a remarkably accurate miniature of the Hokage Tower. It was at that moment that Hiruzen Sarutobi made a decision that would change the course of the village's history. This child, this strange, brilliant child, needed more than an orphanage could provide. "Naruto," he said gently, "how would you like to come and see the real Hokage Tower from the inside?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, the first truly childlike reaction Sarutobi had seen from him. "Today? Yes, today. And perhaps, if you'd like, we could discuss finding you a more suitable living arrangement." For the first time, a small smile appeared on Naruto's face. It wasn't the broad, uninhibited grin one might expect from a child offered an adventure, but a measured expression of genuine pleasure. "I would find that agreeable, Lord Hokage." As they left the orphanage together, Sarutobi couldn't help but wonder what forces had shaped this unusual child. Was it the fox's influence? Something inherited from his brilliant parents? Or simply the circumstances of his isolated upbringing? Whatever the cause, the third Hokage knew one thing with certainty. Naruto Uzumaki was going to be someone extraordinary. 2 years later, Naruto stood before the bookshelf in his small apartment, fingers trailing over the spines of his growing collection. At 5 years old, he had already outgrown most of the educational materials suitable for children his age. The Hokage had arranged for him to receive a modest stipend, enough to cover his basic needs, and Naruto allocated a precise percentage of it each month for books. Today's acquisition was particularly valuable, a beginner's text on chakra theory that he'd had to special order. The shopkeeper had been reluctant to sell such material to a child, but Naruto had presented a note from the Hokage authorizing the purchase. He suspected the note might not have been strictly necessary. The Hokage's regular visits to his apartment were well known, and few villagers wanted to risk offending the god of shinobi by mistreating his young ward. Not that the villagers were openly hostile. Unlike the alternative timeline that sometimes flickered through Naruto's dreams, strange, vivid images of a louder, brighter, more hated version of himself, the people of Konoha mostly treated him with cautious distance. His reputation as an unusual, too serious child had spread, and most adults found his penetrating gaze and advanced vocabulary discomforting. The children were simpler. They avoided him because he was different, because he didn't laugh at their jokes or join their games. Naruto understood this was natural human behavior. People gravitated toward the familiar and shunned the foreign. He had read enough psychology texts to recognize the pattern. What the texts couldn't tell him was why a part of him still yearned for connection, despite the logical advantages of his solitude. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. The Hokage always visited on the 5th day of the month, at precisely 4 in the afternoon. "Good afternoon, Lord Hokage," Naruto said as he opened the door. "Please come in." Sarutobi entered, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Hello, Naruto. I've brought you something I think you'll find interesting." Naruto accepted the package with a small bow. "Thank you. Would you like tea?" "I've been experimenting with a blend of green tea and jasmine. My research indicates it has calming properties that might be beneficial after a day of administrative duties." The Hokage smiled, settling into what had become his usual chair. "That sounds lovely." As Naruto prepared the tea with methodical precision, Sarutobi observed the apartment. It was impeccably organized for a living space occupied by a 5-year-old. Books were arranged by subject and then alphabetically. The few toys that had been gifts from the Hokage himself were neatly stored in a trunk, most looking barely used. The only item that seemed to receive regular attention was a potted plant near the window, a small bonsai that Naruto tended with surprising care. "How are your studies progressing?" Sarutobi asked as Naruto served the tea in cups that were slightly too large for his small hands, yet he managed without spilling a drop. "Efficiently," Naruto replied, sitting across from his visitor. "I've completed the basic arithmetic texts and have moved on to algebraic concepts. My reading comprehension tests at approximately the level of a 12-year-old, according to the assessment materials you provided." He gestured to the new book on chakra theory. "I'm ready to begin more advanced studies in shinobi arts." Sarutobi sipped his tea thoughtfully. "You're still planning to enter the academy next year then?" "Yes. It's the most logical path forward. While private tutoring might accelerate my technical development, the academy provides essential socialization and team-building experiences that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere." Naruto tilted his head slightly. "Also, I believe you want me to attend for political reasons. My visible integration into the village's standard shinobi development program would normalize my status in the eyes of both the council and the general population." The Hokage nearly choked on his tea. Sometimes he forgot just how perceptive the boy was. "You've given this considerable thought." "I analyze our conversations carefully," Naruto said matter-of-factly. "You rarely state your political considerations explicitly, but the patterns are discernible." He paused, then added with unusual hesitation, "I appreciate your efforts on my behalf, Lord Hokage." It was as close to emotional expression as the boy typically came, and Sarutobi recognized it as significant. "You're welcome, Naruto. Now why don't you open your gift?" Naruto carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a set of chakra-sensitive papers and a slim manual titled Basic Chakra Exercises for Beginners. "These are typically not introduced until the 2nd year at the academy," Naruto observed, running his fingers over the materials with poorly concealed excitement. It was one of the few times his carefully maintained composure showed cracks, when presented with new knowledge to absorb. "I believe you're ready for them now," Sarutobi said. "With supervision, of course. I've arranged for a Chunin instructor to visit twice weekly to guide your initial chakra development. A young man named Irika Yumino. He'll be teaching at the academy when you begin next year." Naruto nodded, already flipping through the manual with intense focus. "Logical. Early familiarity with an instructor will facilitate more efficient learning when formal education begins." He looked up. "Thank you, Lord Hokage. This is most helpful." Sarutobi smiled at the understatement. He could see the barely contained eagerness in the boy's eyes. For all his unusual maturity and calculated speech, Naruto was still a child in many ways, particularly in his thirst for knowledge and growth. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Naruto," the Hokage said, his tone growing more serious. "It concerns your special circumstances." Naruto's expression immediately shifted, becoming more guarded. "You're referring to the nine-tailed fox sealed within me." It wasn't a question. Sarutobi had informed Naruto of his Jinchuriki status on his 4th birthday, judging that the boy was mature enough to handle the information and preferring that he learn it in a controlled setting rather than through village gossip. Naruto had received the news with characteristic calmness, asking detailed technical questions about the sealing process, and requesting books on Fuinjutsu the very next day. Yes, Sarutobi confirmed. As you begin to work with your chakra more actively, you may notice differences between your chakra and the standard descriptions in the texts. The fox's chakra is sealed, but its presence still influences your own chakra network, creating higher than average chakra reserves and potentially affecting control precision, Naruto finished. I've hypothesized as much from the limited information available. The texts on Jinchuriki are frustratingly vague on the practical aspects of chakra development. That's because each Jinchuriki's experience is unique, Sarutobi explained. The relationship between host and tailed beast varies greatly depending on the specific seal used, the age at which the sealing occurred, and the individual chakra characteristics of both parties. Naruto nodded thoughtfully. A research area with insufficient data points for reliable generalization. I understand. He hesitated before asking, will the fox's presence make it more difficult for me to perform adequately at the academy? It was a carefully phrased question, but Sarutobi heard the underlying concern, one of the few instances where Naruto's age showed through his composed exterior. The boy wanted reassurance that he could succeed. It will present unique challenges, the Hokage answered honestly, particularly for techniques requiring fine chakra control, but it also offers advantages. Your chakra reserves will likely exceed those of your instructors, let alone your peers. A trade-off between precision and power, Naruto summarized. Acceptable. I'll develop compensatory training methods. Sarutobi finished his tea, setting the cup down gently. I have no doubt you will. Your capacity for adaptation is remarkable, Naruto. The boy inclined his head slightly at the compliment but didn't smile. It's a necessary survival trait. Adaptation maximizes operational effectiveness across variable conditions. It was such a clinical assessment from one so young that Sarutobi felt a pang of sadness. Sometimes he wondered if he'd made a mistake in not insisting Naruto be placed with a family instead of living alone. But the few attempts to introduce him to potential foster parents had been awkward failures. The boy's penetrating gaze and unsettling maturity had made most adults uncomfortable, and Naruto himself had shown little interest in forming familial bonds. Will there be anything else, Lord Hokage? Naruto asked, noticing the older man's extended silence. Sarutobi shook his head. No, that's all for today. I'll send Irika to begin your chakra training on Monday. 4 o'clock. I'll be prepared, Naruto assured him, rising to see his visitor to the door with formal politeness that would have been amusing in a child if it weren't so perfectly executed. As the door closed behind him, Hiruzen Sarutobi sighed heavily. Brilliant as the boy was, there was something profoundly sad about his solitary existence. Yet every attempt to change that had been met with either passive resistance or logical arguments about the efficiency of his current lifestyle. Perhaps the academy would help. Perhaps interaction with children his own age would bring out whatever dormant social instincts lay buried beneath that calculating exterior. Or perhaps Naruto Uzumaki was simply destined to walk a different path from other children, a path of shadows and analytical precision, more akin to the prodigies who found their way into ANBU than to the boisterous genin teams that formed the backbone of Konoha's forces. Only time would tell. 1 year later, first day at the academy. The morning air was crisp and cool as Naruto made his way toward the academy. He had calculated the optimal departure time from his apartment to arrive exactly 15 minutes before the welcoming ceremony, early enough to observe the other students and familiarize himself with the physical layout, but not so early as to draw undue attention. He wore a simple outfit, dark blue pants, a mesh armor undershirt, and a high-collared gray jacket. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make him stand out. His equipment pouch was precisely arranged according to the standard academy configuration, with a few additional items he determined might be useful. A notebook with water-resistant pages, a set of precision-weighted pencils, a small book on chakra meditation techniques, disguised with a cover that suggested it was ordinary fiction. As he approached the academy grounds, Naruto slowed his pace, taking in the scene with careful attention. Parents clustered in groups, some anxiously fussing over their children, others chatting with fellow adults. The children themselves exhibited varying behaviors, some projecting confidence, others displaying clear anxiety markers, a few already forming social groupings based on prior connections. Naruto categorized and filed away each observation, building a mental map of the social landscape. This information would be valuable in the coming days. He chose a position near a large tree, slightly removed from the main gathering but with clear sight lines to all relevant areas. From here, he could observe without being immediately noticed. It was a habit he developed early, the ability to fade into the background despite his distinctive blonde hair and facial markings. Hiding already, eh? Came a lazy drawl from above. Naruto didn't startle. He'd been peripherally aware of a presence in the tree, though he hadn't given it focused attention. Looking up, he saw a boy with his hair tied in a spiky ponytail, lounging on a branch as if it were the most comfortable bed in the village. Efficient observation requires minimal interference in the observed system, Naruto replied evenly. You appear to have reached a similar conclusion, the boy snorted softly. I just didn't want to be dragged into any more troublesome goodbyes. My mom was getting emotional. He studied Naruto for a moment. You're that kid, aren't you? The one who lives alone. Naruto. Naruto nodded once. And you're Shikamaru Nara, son of Shikaka Nara, Jonin commander of Konohagakure. Your clan specializes in shadow manipulation techniques and strategic operations. You arrived 27 minutes ago, spent 12 minutes enduring your mother's attentions, then retreated to this location to avoid further interaction. Shikamaru's eyebrows rose slightly. That's pretty accurate. And kind of creepy, if I'm being honest. I apologize if my observations made you uncomfortable, Naruto said without inflection. Information gathering is a critical shinobi skill. I practice it habitually. The Nara boy stared at him for a long moment then sighed. Whatever. Just tone it down around others. Most kids don't like feeling like they're being analyzed. Naruto filed this advice away. It aligned with his prior experiences and with the psychological texts he'd studied. Noted. Thank you for the tactical social input. A ghost of a smile flickered across Shikamaru's face. You're a weird one. It wasn't said unkindly, but not as troublesome as most. At least you're quiet. Before Naruto could respond, a bell rang, signaling the students to gather for the welcoming ceremony. Shikamaru slid off his branch with reluctant grace, landing beside Naruto. Guess we should go, he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. Coming? Naruto nodded, falling into step beside the Nara boy. It was an unexpected development. He hadn't planned on forming any immediate social connections. But perhaps this was advantageous. The Nara clan was known for intelligence. An association with Shikamaru could provide valuable insights. The welcoming ceremony was predictably tedious. A series of speeches emphasizing the will of fire, the honor of serving the village, and the responsibilities of being a shinobi in training. Naruto paid just enough attention to capture any relevant information while using the majority of his mental resources to continue observing his future classmates. He noted the Uchiha heir, Sasuke, surrounded by a small crowd of admiring children, primarily female. The boy's body language suggested he found the attention tiresome but was too well-mannered to reject it outright. Interesting. The last survivor of the Uchiha massacre, barring the perpetrator, would be a significant data point in Naruto's ongoing study of village dynamics. There was the Hyuga heiress as well, standing apart from the others, her posture perfect but her eyes downcast. Hinata, if he recalled correctly from his research on clan structures, her finger-tapping pattern indicated elevated anxiety. Another potentially valuable contact, given the Hyuga clan's political significance, though her apparent social reticence might make direct approach suboptimal. Elsewhere in the crowd, Naruto identified several other clan heirs. The Inuzuka boy with his puppy, the Yamanaka girl deep in conversation with a plump boy who could only be the Akimichi heir. Each represented potential alliances or complications, depending on how events unfolded. When the ceremony concluded, the students were directed to their assigned classrooms. Naruto found himself in Class 1B, under the instruction of Irika Yumino. As expected, given the Chunin's prior involvement in his pre-academy training, the classroom was arranged in tiered rows, with 3-person desks. Naruto selected a seat in the middle row, off to the side, visible enough to avoid seeming intentionally isolated, but not centrally located enough to draw attention. The optimal position for his purposes. To his mild surprise, Shikamaru slid into the seat beside him a few minutes later. Mind if I join you? You're less likely to pester me with conversation than most. Your assessment is accurate, Naruto confirmed. I have no objection to your presence. The third seat at their desk was eventually taken by a rather round boy munching on a bag of chips, who Shikamaru greeted as Choji. The Akimichi heir then? Naruto nodded politely to the newcomer but said nothing, turning his attention to Irika as the instructor called for order. Welcome to your first day at the Konoha Ninja Academy, Irika began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of an experienced teacher. Today marks the beginning of your journey to becoming Shinobi of the Leaf. I'll be your primary instructor for the next several years, guiding you through both theoretical studies and practical training. He proceeded to outline the curriculum: history, mathematics, geography, basic taijutsu, weapon practice, and eventually, chakra theory and ninjutsu. Nothing Naruto didn't already know, but he dutifully noted the specific sequencing and emphasis Irika placed on certain subjects. Before we begin our first lesson, Irika continued, I'd like each of you to introduce yourself to the class. Please share your name, something you enjoy, and your reason for wanting to become a shinobi. Naruto mentally adjusted his plans. Self-introduction was a standard social protocol, but it presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Too much revelation could compromise his strategic position, but too little might mark him as deliberately secretive. A careful balance was required. As the introductions moved through the classroom, Naruto analyzed each student's presentation, noting not just what they said but how they said it: confidence levels, signs of deception, indications of pre-existing social connections. When his turn came, he stood calmly, meeting Irika's encouraging gaze with steady eyes. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, he stated, keeping his voice measured and neutral. I enjoy studying efficient systems and practicing precision skills. I am pursuing the shinobi path because it offers the most practical application of my natural aptitudes, and provides the greatest potential for meaningful contribution to the village's sustainability. There was a moment of confused silence following his introduction. It wasn't the typical enthusiastic declaration of dreams about becoming Hokage or protecting loved ones that many other children had offered. But Irika, familiar with Naruto's unusual manner, simply nodded and called on the next student. As he sat down, Naruto caught Shikamaru giving him a sidelong glance. Natural aptitudes, huh? The Nara boy murmured. That's one way of putting it. Naruto tilted his head questioningly. Nothing, Shikamaru said with a small shrug. Just thinking you might be more interesting than you're letting on. Naruto allowed himself a slight nod of acknowledgement. Perhaps. But undue interest can be tactically disadvantageous in unfamiliar territory. So you're playing it safe, Shikamaru translated, his eyes showing a flicker of genuine interest. Smart. I prefer to think of it as strategic resource management, Naruto replied quietly. Revealing capabilities prematurely reduces future operational flexibility. Shikamaru's mouth quirked up at one corner. Definitely interesting, he muttered before turning his attention back to the ongoing introductions. The rest of the morning passed in a predictable manner. Irika distributed textbooks, explained classroom protocols, and began a basic assessment of the students' current knowledge levels. Naruto deliberately performed at approximately the 70th percentile, demonstrating competence without drawing exceptional attention. When lunchtime arrived, the children spilled out into the academy courtyard, quickly forming small groups based on pre-existing friendships or morning interactions. Naruto had brought a nutritionally optimized meal in a simple bento box, and sought out a quiet spot to eat while continuing his observations. To his mild surprise, Shikamaru and Choji joined him under the shade of a large tree. Hope you don't mind, Choji said between bites of his considerably larger lunch. Shikamaru said you wouldn't be troublesome. I have no objection to your presence, Naruto replied, the same phrase he'd used earlier with Shikamaru. He paused, then added, your meal appears to be expertly prepared. Akimichi clan recipes are renowned for their efficient caloric delivery systems. Choji blinked, then broke into a wide smile. Yeah. My mom makes the best food in the village. Want to try some? He held out a rice ball that looked to be stuffed with some kind of seasoned meat. Naruto hesitated. The offer represented an unexpected social ritual, food sharing as a bonding mechanism. After a brief analysis of potential outcomes, he accepted the rice ball with a small nod. "Thank you, that's kind." He took a careful bite, noting the complex flavor profile. The balance of protein, carbohydrates, and spices is impressive. Optimal for sustained energy release during training activities. Choji's smile widened further. "I like him," he declared to Shikamaru. "He appreciates food properly." Shikamaru gave a lazy shrug, but his eyes were keenly observing the interaction. "Told you he was different." For the remainder of the lunch period, Naruto primarily listened as Choji and Shikamaru discussed various topics, from cloud patterns to the best flavor of chips to the troublesome nature of parents. He contributed occasionally with relevant observations but focused mainly on understanding the dynamics of this unexpected social connection. When they returned to the classroom for afternoon lessons, Naruto found himself experiencing an unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't quite pleasure in the conventional sense, but rather a subtle satisfaction with the day's unexpected developments. His initial plan had been simple observation and strategic positioning. Instead, he had established what appeared to be a nascent social alliance with two clan heirs, one of whom possessed analytical capabilities that potentially rivaled his own. The afternoon was dedicated to a preliminary physical assessment. Iruka led the class to the training grounds, where he evaluated their basic physical capabilities: running, jumping, throwing accuracy, and rudimentary taijutsu forms. Here again, Naruto calibrated his performance carefully. He demonstrated slightly above average speed and strength, excellent precision in thrown weapons, a skill he had practiced extensively in private, and solid but unexceptional taijutsu forms. Enough to establish himself as competent but not enough to stand out dramatically from his peers. The exception to this approach came during the endurance assessment, where Naruto's Jinchuriki-enhanced stamina was impossible to fully conceal without appearing suspiciously weak. When the running exercise extended beyond what most children could maintain, Naruto gradually allowed more of his classmates to drop out until only he, Sasuke Uchiha, and Kiba Inuzuka remained. Sasuke gave him a measuring look as they continued to circle the training field, their breaths forming small clouds in the cooling afternoon air. There was calculation in the Uchiha's dark eyes, recognition of a potential rival. Naruto returned the look with a neutral gaze, neither challenging nor submissive. Then, making a split-second decision based on his long-term objectives, he gradually reduced his pace, allowing a minor but visible falter in his stride. Sasuke pushed forward, seizing the opportunity to pull ahead, while Kiba, already struggling, fell behind with a frustrated growl. 2 more circuits and Iruka called an end to the exercise, with Sasuke the clear victor. "Excellent work, all of you," the instructor said, addressing the entire class, many of whom were still catching their breath. "Especially you 3 who demonstrated superior endurance. Sasuke, Naruto, Kiba, well done." Sasuke accepted the praise with a quiet nod, but his posture showed clear satisfaction. Kiba was more vocal, declaring that next time he'd win for sure. Naruto simply inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression revealing nothing of the deliberate calculation behind his performance. As the class was dismissed for the day, Naruto gathered his belongings methodically, reviewing the day's observations and adjusting his ongoing strategies accordingly. He had collected a significant amount of data on his classmates, established a baseline performance level that would allow for strategic improvement when necessary, and unexpectedly formed preliminary social connections that could prove valuable. Most importantly, he had begun the process of crafting his public persona: competent but not remarkable, intelligent but not brilliant, sociable but not outgoing. A carefully constructed middle ground that would allow him to operate with minimal scrutiny while he developed his skills and gathered information. "See you tomorrow, Naruto," Shikamaru called as he left with Choji, both being collected by their mothers at the academy gate. Naruto raised a hand in acknowledgement, watching as the 2 boys joined their waiting parents. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to wonder what that experience might be like. Having someone waiting at the end of the day, someone interested in hearing about his activities, someone who would notice if his performance deviated from the expected pattern. He dismissed the thought as irrelevant. His current living arrangement maximized his independence and minimized potential surveillance. It was optimal for his purposes. As he walked home alone, Naruto observed the village with the same careful attention he'd given his classmates. The patterns of civilian movement, the positioning of on-duty shinobi, the subtle security measures woven into the village's seemingly casual layout. All of it formed a complex system that he was slowly mapping in his mind. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the village. Naruto prepared a simple dinner, reviewed his notes from the day, and then settled into his evening meditation routine, an exercise that helped him maintain the mental partitions necessary for his long-term planning. In the quiet of his mind, he sorted through the day's experiences, categorizing and analyzing each interaction, each piece of information. But beneath this methodical process, almost hidden from his own awareness, was a small, warm ember of something unfamiliar. Not quite happiness. He understood that emotion primarily as a theoretical concept rather than a lived experience. But something adjacent to it, a sense that perhaps the path ahead might include not just strategic alliances but actual connections. It was a hypothesis worth testing, he decided as sleep finally claimed him. After all, even the most brilliant strategic mind could benefit from trusted associates. Even Itachi Uchiha, the prodigy whose analytical approach Naruto had studied from what limited information was available, had initially operated within a team structure. The key would be balance. Maintaining his careful observations and calculated planning while allowing for the potential advantages of selective social integration. Tomorrow would provide more data points. Tomorrow, he would continue building his place within the Academy's ecosystem, positioning himself precisely where he needed to be, hiding in plain sight, watching, learning, planning. Tomorrow, the true work would begin. As Naruto drifted into sleep, his mind continued to process, to calculate, to strategize. And somewhere deep within the seal that bound the nine-tailed fox, something stirred, curious about the unusual mind of its host. The first month, the academy quickly settled into a predictable rhythm. Each day brought its scheduled lessons, history in the morning, followed by mathematics or geography, then physical training in the afternoon. The pattern suited Naruto perfectly. Predictability allowed for efficient time management and strategic planning. By the end of the first month, Naruto had mapped the complete social hierarchy of Class 1B. Sasuke Uchiha occupied the top position among the boys, his status secured by his clan name, natural abilities, and the mystique of tragedy that surrounded him. Among the girls, a complex sub-hierarchy had formed with Ino Yamanaka and Sakura Haruno engaged in an ongoing competition for dominance, primarily centered around gaining Sasuke's attention. Naruto himself had secured a position of comfortable obscurity. He was known but not particularly noted, the quiet, somewhat odd boy who sat with Shikamaru and Choji. His academic performance remained deliberately calibrated to the upper middle range, strong enough to avoid remedial attention but not exceptional enough to draw particular praise. His relationships with Shikamaru and Choji had developed along unexpected lines. What had begun as a tactical association had evolved into something approaching genuine companionship. Shikamaru, in particular, seemed to appreciate Naruto's lack of troublesome emotional demands and occasional insights into complex problems. "You're playing a long game, aren't you?" Shikamaru asked one afternoon as they sat watching clouds drift overhead. It was their free period, and Choji had been called home early for a clan ceremony. Naruto glanced at his companion, measuring his response. "What makes you say that?" Shikamaru didn't look away from the clouds. "You're holding back in class. Not just physically, that's obvious to anyone paying attention, but academically too." He turned his head slightly, fixing Naruto with a penetrating gaze. "You knew the answer to Irika-sensei's question about the 3rd Shinobi War's Eastern Front commanders yesterday. I saw you writing it in your notes before he even finished asking." "Perhaps I was simply making an educated guess," Naruto suggested mildly. "Perhaps," Shikamaru agreed, turning back to the sky. "Or perhaps you've been reading military history texts that most of us won't see until we're Chunin." After a pause, he added, "I don't care, you know. Whatever game you're playing, it's your business. Just thought you might want to know that someone noticed." Naruto considered this information carefully. Shikamaru was more observant than he'd accounted for, a miscalculation on his part. The question now was whether this observation represented a threat to his overall strategy, or a potential asset. I find it tactically advantageous to maintain a low profile, he finally said, choosing his words with precision. Excessive attention in either positive or negative dimensions creates unnecessary complications. Shikamaru snorted softly. Yeah, I get that. Same reason I pretend to sleep through half our lessons. He closed his eyes. Your secret's safe with me. Too troublesome to tell anyone anyway. The conversation shifted to other topics after that, but Naruto filed the interaction away as significant. Shikamaru Nara had identified himself as both more perceptive than the average academy student and disinclined to disrupt Naruto's carefully constructed public persona. This made him simultaneously a potential security risk and a valuable ally. Later that same week, Naruto had an equally unexpected interaction with Hinata Hyuga. The shy heiress rarely spoke to anyone, but Naruto had noticed her watching him with peculiar intensity on multiple occasions. His initial hypothesis was that she had somehow identified him as a Jinchuriki, and was monitoring him out of fear or suspicion. The reality proved more complex. They were paired together during kunai practice, taking turns retrieving the thrown weapons. As Naruto collected their kunai from the target, he noticed Hinata's fingers pressed together in that familiar nervous gesture. Your throwing technique is efficient, he offered, handing her the kunai. Your wrist rotation is precisely calibrated for minimal air resistance. She startled visibly at being addressed directly, her pale eyes widening. Thank you, Naruto-kun. Your technique is also very good. Naruto tilted his head slightly, analyzing her response. The honorific was interesting, she didn't use it with other classmates. Combined with the increased stammering and a slight flush across her cheeks, the data suggested an emotional response rather than a threat assessment. You've been observing me, he stated simply, testing this hypothesis. The flush deepened dramatically. You're very. She seemed unable to complete the thought, her discomfort reaching levels that Naruto found somewhat alarming. I apologize if my direct approach caused you distress, he said, taking a small step back to increase her personal space. That was not my intention. No. The sudden volume of her response surprised them both, and she immediately lowered her voice to a whisper. No, I think you're interesting. Naruto processed this new information. Interesting, he repeated, testing the word. May I ask what specifically you find interesting about me? Hinata stared at the ground, her fingers pressing together so tightly that the tips had turned white. You're always watching everyone, like me. But you understand what you see. And you're kind? The last word was barely audible. Kind? Naruto couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. It was not an adjective he would have applied to himself. Efficient, analytical, strategic. These were the terms that defined his self-concept. Kindness implied an emotional motivation that he generally considered extraneous to his decision-making process. Hinata nodded without looking up. When Akio-kun fell last week, you helped him up before anyone noticed. When Sakura-san couldn't reach the library shelf, you got the book for her without making her ask. You give Choji-kun some of your lunch when he's still hungry, even though you always bring exactly the right amount for yourself. Naruto blinked slowly, reassessing. Hinata Hyuga was far more observant than he had given her credit for. She had noticed details of his behavior that he had believed to be effectively invisible to his classmates. More unsettling was her interpretation of those actions. What he had categorized as logical responses to maintain social harmony and avoid unwanted attention, she had read as acts of kindness. It suggested either a misreading of his motivations or, more disturbingly, that his own understanding of his motivations might be incomplete. I see, he said finally. Your observations are detailed. You have good situational awareness. It was the closest thing to a compliment he typically offered, and Hinata seemed to recognize this, her flush changing quality from embarrassment to something more like pleasure. Thank you, Naruto-kun. Before they could continue the conversation, Irika called for the class to rotate partners. As Hinata moved away, Naruto found himself mentally reordering his assessment of his classmates. Hinata Hyuga had just moved several positions up in his hierarchy of potentially significant individuals. These interactions with Shikamaru and Hinata prompted Naruto to reconsider certain aspects of his strategy. He had been operating under the assumption that remaining unremarkable was the optimal approach. but perhaps complete invisibility was neither possible nor desirable. There would always be observant individuals who noticed patterns others missed. The question was how to incorporate this reality into his plans. Complete recalibration was unnecessary, but adjustments were clearly indicated. That evening, as he prepared his dinner, a precisely balanced meal of rice, grilled fish, and steamed vegetables, Naruto considered the problem from multiple angles. If certain individuals were going to see through aspects of his carefully constructed persona regardless of his efforts, perhaps the most efficient approach was to selectively reveal controlled portions of his true capabilities to those specific individuals. Shikamaru, for instance, might be more valuable as a knowing ally than as a deceived acquaintance. His strategic mind would be an asset if properly engaged, and Hinata's observational skills, combined with her apparent positive disposition toward Naruto, could provide insights into social dynamics that his own analytical approach sometimes missed. It was a calculated risk, but one with potentially significant rewards. By establishing a small circle of trusted associates who were aware of at least some aspects of his true nature, he could gain the benefits of collaboration, while still maintaining his broader strategy of inconspicuousness. Decision made, Naruto adjusted his mental models in preparation for the following day. He would begin a careful process of selective revelation, starting with Shikamaru. Nothing dramatic, simply a gradual demonstration of his actual intellectual capabilities within the privacy of their small group. As he completed his evening meditation, Naruto found himself contemplating Hinata's assessment of him as kind. It was not a quality he had ever consciously cultivated, yet she had perceived it nonetheless. Perhaps there were aspects of his behavior, or even his fundamental nature, that his own analytical framework had failed to capture. An intriguing hypothesis, and one worth exploring further. The Hokage's office. So, how is our young friend adjusting to the academy? Sarutobi asked, puffing contentedly on his pipe as he reviewed the report before him. Irika Yumino shifted slightly in his chair. That's a complex question, Lord Hokage. Oh? Sarutobi's eyebrows rose. Problems? Not exactly, Irika said carefully. Academically, he's performing well, consistently in the top third of the class, though never at the very top. His taijutsu is solid, his weapon skills are excellent, and his theoretical knowledge is clearly advanced for his age. But? Sarutobi prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in the Chunin's voice. Irika sighed. But I can't shake the feeling that he's holding back, deliberately positioning himself to be noticed just enough to avoid standing out for underperformance, but never enough to be considered exceptional. The Hokage nodded thoughtfully. And socially? That's even more difficult to assess, Irika admitted. He's not isolated exactly. He's formed what appears to be a genuine friendship with Shikamaru Nara and Choji Akimichi. The other students generally find him a bit odd but not objectionable. He's unfailingly polite, completes group assignments efficiently, and never causes disruptions. Yet? Sarutobi again heard the hesitation. Yet there's something calculated about his interactions. As if he's constantly measuring his responses against some internal metric. Irika frowned, trying to articulate his concerns. Most children his age act on impulse. They laugh when they're happy, yell when they're angry, cry when they're hurt. Naruto doesn't. Everything he does seems to serve a purpose beyond the immediate moment. Sarutobi took a long draw on his pipe, considering this assessment. It aligned with his own observations of the boy over the years. You find this concerning. It wasn't quite a question, but Irika nodded anyway. I do, Lord Hokage. Not because I think he harbors any ill intent, quite the opposite. He shows more consideration for his classmates' well-being than many children his age. But this level of self-control, this constant calculation, it's not natural for a 6-year-old. I worry about what it might mean for his development. You think he's unhappy? Sarutobi asked. Irika hesitated. I don't know if unhappy is the right word. I'm not sure Naruto conceptualizes emotion the way most people do. It's almost as if he approaches feelings as data points to be analyzed rather than experiences to be lived. The Hokage nodded slowly. He had harbored similar concerns since Naruto's earliest years. The boy's unusual mind had always been evident, but its implications for his emotional and social development were increasingly apparent as he grew older. Continue to monitor him, Sarutobi instructed. But don't intervene unless absolutely necessary. Naruto's path may be unconventional, but that doesn't mean it's wrong for him. Some shinobi walk in sunlight, others in shadow. Both serve the village in their own way. Yes, Lord Hokage, Iruka agreed, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with this approach. After the Chunin had departed, Sarutobi turned to gaze out the window at the village spread below. Somewhere out there, a small boy with bright blonde hair and the mind of a strategist was carefully navigating a world that didn't quite know what to make of him. Your son is quite the puzzle, Minato, he murmured to the absent fourth Hokage. But I believe he'll find his way. In fact, I suspect he'll forge paths none of us have even imagined. The hidden observer, deep within the ANBU headquarters, a masked figure reviewed a thin file containing observations of Academy students identified as having unusual potential. Most such reports were routine, talented clan children showing early signs of their bloodline abilities, civilian-born students with surprising chakra control, the occasional prodigy whose skills demanded accelerated training. But one report had caught the operative's attention. Not because of detailed exceptional performance. Quite the opposite. The report noted a student whose carefully calibrated mediocrity raised more questions than a record of excellence would have. Naruto Uzumaki, Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox, ward of the third Hokage. And if this assessment was accurate, possessor of a mind far more sophisticated than his age or academic record suggested, the operative set the file aside and made a note in a separate ledger. This would require personal observation. Children who hide their abilities typically do so for a reason. Understanding that reason might prove valuable to the village, to certain interested parties, or perhaps simply to the operative's own curiosity. After all, the most dangerous minds were often those that no one thought to watch carefully. And in a village full of shinobi trained to look underneath the underneath, sometimes the most effective concealment was hiding in plain sight. The operative closed the ledger and replaced it in a drawer that would have triggered 3 separate lethal traps for anyone else who attempted to open it. Then, with a silent flicker of movement, the masked figure vanished from the room, leaving no trace of their interest in the unusual academy student. Naruto's apartment evening. Naruto sat cross-legged on the floor of his apartment, eyes closed, breathing steady. The chakra paper the Hokage had given him months ago lay on the floor before him, still unmarked. He had been methodically working through the chakra control exercises in the accompanying manual, mastering each one before proceeding to the next. Tonight, he would attempt to channel his chakra into the paper, revealing his elemental affinity. He had studied the theoretical aspects extensively. Most shinobi didn't discover their elemental affinity until much later in their training, but Naruto saw no logical reason to delay this knowledge. Information was power, and understanding his own capabilities was essential to efficient development. Gradually, he extended his awareness inward, finding the familiar flow of his chakra. It moved through his network in patterns he had mapped through countless hours of meditation, primarily smooth and controlled, but with occasional turbulent eddies where the seal integrated the fox's chakra with his own. These turbulent areas had initially presented challenges for his control exercises, but Naruto had developed compensatory techniques, mentally visualizing the chakra flow as a complex mathematical equation that he could balance by adjusting specific variables. Now, with practiced precision, he gathered a small amount of chakra at his center, guided it along his meridians to his hand, and released it in a controlled stream toward the paper. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the paper split cleanly down the middle. Wind affinity. Interesting. Naruto opened his eyes, studying the halved paper with satisfaction. Wind was relatively uncommon in Konoha, which suggested potential strategic advantages in the future. It was also an offensive-oriented element, known for its cutting power and penetrative capabilities. Useful. As he reached to collect the paper halves, he noticed something unusual. At the very edge of one piece, a tiny corner had become damp. It was barely noticeable, just a few millimeters of moisture, but it was definitely there. Naruto frowned slightly. Dual affinities were rare, especially in those without a bloodline limit. And water affinity manifesting alongside wind was particularly unusual. Could it be a testing anomaly? Or perhaps an effect of the fox's chakra influencing his own? He made a mental note to research this phenomenon further, then carefully stored the paper pieces in a small box where he kept significant data samples. It was a minor mystery, but in Naruto's experience, minor mysteries often contained insights that proved valuable in unexpected ways. Rising from his meditation position, he moved to his desk and opened his journal, recording the results of the experiment in precise detail. Then he added several questions for future investigation. 1. Is the secondary water affinity genuine or an anomaly? 2. If genuine, is it related to the Nine-Tails chakra integration? 3. What training methods would most efficiently develop dual affinities? 4. Should this information be shared with Irika-sensei or the Hokage at this time? The last question gave him pause. His instinct was to keep this information private for now, adding it to the growing collection of capabilities he maintained outside his public persona. But he recognized that this instinct wasn't necessarily logical in all cases. Sometimes, strategic disclosure could provide access to resources or training that would otherwise be unavailable. After careful consideration, Naruto decided to withhold the information temporarily. Once he had gathered more data on the secondary affinity and assessed its significance, he could reevaluate the potential benefits of disclosure against the advantages of continued concealment. Decision made, he closed his journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful observation, measured performance, and strategic positioning at the academy. Another day of building his foundations while keeping his true potential hidden from all but a carefully selected few. As Naruto settled into sleep, his mind continued its habitual processing, analyzing the day's events, updating probability models, refining future strategies. But beneath these conscious calculations, in the deeper layers of his developing psyche, other processes were at work. The mind of a child, even one as unusual as Naruto, is not a fixed system. It grows, adapts, evolves in response to experience. And Naruto's experiences, the subtle kindness of the Hokage, the lazy acceptance of Shikamaru, the quiet admiration of Hinata, the grudging respect of Sasuke, were shaping him in ways his conscious mind had not yet recognized. Hidden behind his carefully constructed facade, behind even his own self-perception as a purely analytical being, something was taking root. Something that would one day challenge his most fundamental assumptions about himself and his place in the world. But that was for the future. For now, Naruto Uzumaki slept, his breathing even, his mind still calculating, still planning, still preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. And deep within the seal that bound the nine-tailed fox, a pair of ancient eyes opened, regarding the mindscape around them with growing curiosity. Its host was unlike any Jinchuriki it had encountered in its long existence. Less emotional, more measured, almost reminiscent of certain Uchiha from ages past, but without their characteristic arrogance. Interesting. Perhaps this imprisonment would prove less tedious than the fox had anticipated. At the very least, watching this unusual human's development might provide some entertainment in the decades to come. The fox settled back, its immense consciousness receding into the background of Naruto's sleeping mind. There was no rush. It had patience enough to wait and see what this calculating child would become. Strategic mediocrity. The seasons changed, leaves falling and snow coming and going, as Naruto's first year at the academy progressed with methodical predictability. Spring had returned to Konoha, painting the village in soft pinks and vibrant greens, signaling that the academic year was nearly complete. Naruto sat at his desk, carefully calculating the score he needed on the upcoming written assessment to maintain his precise standing in the class rankings. After months of strategic performance modulation, he had established himself firmly in the middle upper portion of the academic hierarchy, high enough to avoid remedial attention but low enough to escape heightened scrutiny that accompanied exceptional achievement. It was, in his assessment, the optimal position. "You know," Shikamaru murmured beside him, eyes half-lidded as always but sharp with awareness. "It must take more effort to consistently score exactly 84% than to just answer everything correctly." Naruto didn't look up from his notes. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't." Shikamaru yawned deliberately. "Just like I don't deliberately miss questions about the third Hokage's economic policies because they're too troublesome to explain in full." This earned him a brief sideways glance. Over the past months, their unspoken understanding had evolved into something approaching genuine friendship. Shikamaru never directly challenged Naruto's carefully maintained facade in public, But in private, he occasionally acknowledged the gap between Naruto's demonstrated abilities and his true capabilities. Different strategies for different objectives, Naruto replied quietly. Your performance aligns with your established character traits. As does mine, Shikamaru snorted softly. Yeah, except your established character traits are about as real as Iruka-sensei's claim that he doesn't have a favorite student. Before Naruto could respond, Iruka entered the classroom, calling for attention as he distributed the test papers. The examination itself was trivial, a basic assessment of their knowledge of Konoha's founding and early political structure. Naruto could have answered every question perfectly without effort, having read the complete unabridged historical archives that the Hokage had granted him access to months ago. Instead, he carefully miscalculated the exact date of the first Hokage's treaty with the Land of Lightning, confusing it with a similar treaty signed 3 years later. He deliberately simplified his explanation of the village's early clan integration policies, leaving out key nuances that would have demonstrated a deeper understanding of the political complexities involved. And he intentionally omitted the names of 2 council members from the founding era, names that weren't in their standard textbook but were well documented in the historical records he had studied. By the time he handed in his paper, he was confident he had achieved a score within 1 percentage point of his target. It was a delicate balance. Too perfect a mediocrity would be as suspicious as excellence. As they filed out for the mid-morning break, Choji fell into step beside him and Shikamaru, munching contentedly on a bag of chips. How'd you guys do? He asked between bites. Troublesome, Shikamaru answered predictably. I probably forgot half the council members. Adequately, Naruto replied. Though I may have confused some of the treaty dates. Choji nodded, accepting their answers without suspicion. Unlike Shikamaru, he took their self-assessments at face value, which was precisely why Naruto valued his presence in their small group. Choji's straightforward nature and genuine kindness provided a perfect counterbalance to Shikamaru's penetrating insights and Naruto's calculated interactions. As they settled under their usual tree in the academy yard, Naruto took the opportunity to observe the broader social dynamics of their class. Over the past months, certain patterns had solidified. Sasuke remained at the apex of the male hierarchy, his natural talents and brooding demeanor cementing his position despite his obvious disinterest in the social standing it afforded him. The female hierarchy continued to revolve around proximity to the Uchiha, with Ino and Sakura leading competing factions of admirers. Hey, dead last! Where do you think you're going? Naruto's attention shifted to a commotion near the practice area. Kiba Inuzuka, asserting his position in the dominance hierarchy as he often did, had cornered a civilian-born student named Haru. The boy was physically smaller than most of their classmates, and struggled with the physical aspects of their training, making him an easy target for those inclined toward bullying. I was just going to practice my shuriken throws, Haru stammered, clutching his weapon pouch defensively. What's the point? Kiba scoffed. You couldn't hit the broad side of the Hokage monument. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the potential conflict. Naruto observed with clinical detachment, noting the social dynamics at play. Intervention would draw unwanted attention, potentially disrupting his carefully maintained position of unremarkable competence. Logical analysis suggested that remaining uninvolved was the optimal course, and yet, your assessment is statistically flawed, Naruto heard himself say, stepping forward with measured strides. Haru's accuracy has improved by approximately 23% over the past month. His current success rate is now comparable to the class median. All eyes turned to him in surprise. Naruto rarely involved himself in conflicts, preferring to observe rather than participate. Kiba's eyes narrowed. Nobody asked you, weirdo. True, Naruto acknowledged calmly. However, your premise was factually incorrect. Accurate data is essential for valid conclusions. What are you talking about? Kiba demanded, confusion momentarily overriding his aggression. I believe Naruto is saying you're wrong about Haru's skills, Shikamaru translated lazily, having drifted over to stand beside his friend. And that picking on him makes you look uninformed. Kiba flushed, caught between anger at being challenged and uncertainty about how to respond to Naruto's clinical intervention. It lacked the emotional content of a typical confrontation, offering no obvious avenue for escalation. Whatever, he finally muttered, backing down with a dismissive wave. Not worth my time anyway. As the small crowd dispersed, Haru gave Naruto a hesitant smile. Thanks. I didn't expect anyone to step in. Naruto inclined his head slightly. Your improvement metrics deserve acknowledgement. Statistical accuracy benefits everyone. It wasn't until Haru had moved on to the practice area that Shikamaru raised an eyebrow at him. Statistical accuracy, huh? Nothing to do with Hinata watching the whole thing from behind that tree? Naruto blinked, genuinely surprised. He hadn't been aware of the Hyuga heiress's presence. A quick glance confirmed she was indeed partially concealed behind a nearby tree, her pale eyes widening when she realized she'd been spotted. Her observation was irrelevant to my decision parameters, Naruto stated, though he found himself questioning the complete accuracy of this assessment. His intervention had not been entirely logical. Something else, something less quantifiable, had influenced his choice. Shikamaru just smiled knowingly. Sure it was. Come on, let's get back before Irika-sensei starts looking for us. Troublesome as that would be, as they walked back toward the academy building, Naruto found himself reviewing the incident with unusual uncertainty. His behavior had deviated from his established pattern without clear strategic justification. This warranted further analysis. Later, as they filed back into the classroom, Naruto noticed Hinata watching him with that same quiet intensity he'd come to recognize over the months. When their eyes met briefly, she didn't look away as she once would have. Instead, she offered a small, shy smile before ducking her head. Curiouser and curiouser. Calculated connections. Your stance is suboptimal.